You may not be interested in Russia, but Russia is interested in you. So writes Keir Giles in his book, Russia's War on Everybody. Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022 is a challenge to the West also, and has prompted a range of responses, but also hesitancy, anxiety, and caution. From the expansion of NATO to military investment planning, supply of equipment, and training of Ukrainian troops, the Western alliance, as well as many other countries, are in this war, whether they fully acknowledge and embrace that fact or not. But Russia has been waging a clandestine war against the West for decades. Hostile acts abroad, from poisoning dissidents to shooting down airliners, interfering in elections, spying, hacking, and murdering, have long been part and parcel of Kremlin foreign policy. But what is it all for? Why does Russia consistently behave like this? And what does it hope to achieve? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like our guest speakers, as it helps other people to discover the fantastic content that we create. And of course, the many incredible Ukrainian experts that we also feature on the channel. Please also do consider becoming a patron to support the work of the channel if you like what we do. Keir Giles has spent his career watching, studying, and explaining Russia. Keir's work has appeared in a wide range of academic and military publications across Europe and in North America, and he is a regular contributor and commentator on Russian affairs for international print and broadcast media. He is Senior Consulting Fellow at the UK's Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and also works with the Conflict Studies Research Group, a group of deep subject matter experts on Eurasian security, formerly attached to the British Ministry of Defence. He is a regular contributor to research projects on Russian security issues in the US, UK, and Europe. And of course, he's written some fantastic books on the subject. We will, of course, post details of those in the description of the video, so please do check them out. Keir, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Hello.
Well, I've been looking forward to this for some time, having read a number of your sort of articles and followed you for a considerable period. What we're going to focus on here really is some of the points you cover in your most recent book that we mentioned in the intro. And let's start, as the book follows, you start with a point of describing what makes Russia different. And I think before we jump into current events, it's useful to understand what you perceive the differences to be between Russia and what we would broadly call the West.
Well, you mentioned there that I look in the book at why Russia does these things. Now, in a way, that's a summary of a previous book that I wrote, looking in great detail at what exactly it is that drives Russia to be so hostile to the West. That book was about 3 years ago. It was called Moscow Rules, and it was looking at these deep historical roots for why Russia is always so implacably hostile to the West, and it always comes back to the same state of conflict over and over again. The problem with Moscow Rules was its central argument was we need to recognize that what Russia wants is completely incompatible with what we think is normal or natural or even acceptable. And if that's not resolved, then sooner or later we will be in a deeper crisis and in an open conflict involving Russia and the West. And of course, as you mentioned in your intro, now here we are because those differences were not resolved. And now Russia felt it was strong enough to actually push for what it wanted by invading Ukraine. But coming back to that key question, that why exactly Russia thinks that it is both entitled to do this and has a duty to do this, and in fact is operating in an entirely different environment mentally to what we take for granted as normal and natural in the West, it is simply because Russia hasn't gone through the kind of national or societal transformations that other countries have. If you think of Russia's behavior at the moment and what they say about other countries and how they act, it's perfectly normal for other countries if you go back several centuries. So in a way, the Russian threat is not just something that's external to Europe, it's also external to the time we're in. It's not something that comes from the 21st century. Both the attitudes that Russia is acting on, the idea that Russia is entitled to a land empire, and all of these small independent countries around its periphery don't really have any right to exist. They should be governed from Moscow. But also, when Russia does roll its tanks across the borders, the way Russia behaves and the way its individual soldiers behave, it is something from a far older and far more brutal age. And just over the last 24 hours, we've had additional reports of Russian missile strikes, completely at random, terror strikes on civilians, on cities across Ukraine for no better purpose than sowing terror and death and destruction. And that is not the behavior of a state that we recognize as part of the international community.
And there's a problem, isn't there, with the so-called geopolitical interpretations of events. Without being sort of too mean to them, meaning, of course, here Mearsheimer and others, but there are plenty of them, and they'll look at these issues in terms of sort of game theory and through a Cold War lens. But what they're also doing, in some ways, equating Russia's rationality and methodologies with our own. They're putting on the same level and trying to analyze them rationally. But if Russia is actually behaving as indeed we perhaps behaved several centuries ago, and many sort of land empires did at that period, and if you go down to sort of deep history, which seems to be just a sort of succession of wars, conquests, and utter barbarism, then those geopolitical arguments really aren't capturing the depth of the problem, are they?
That's exactly right. And there are several different aspects to that problem. The whole issue of trying to ascribe Russian behaviors to some kind of theory of international relations is pretty damaging, really, for understanding what it is that Russia thinks about the world and, in fact, how it might react to the world around it. The problem is that if you have people whose entire career has been built around putting forward a theory of how countries work, they are so invested in it by the time they reach the end of their career that they have to ignore facts and reality in order to pretend that that still works. And that is the classic Mearsheimer example that you're talking about there. He has become now so detached from what is happening in the real world in his explanations of current events, not just what actually drives international behavior, that it is irrelevant but still harmful because people are still publishing him. Now, he's the most bright, shining example of how this happens. But in general, trying to categorize Russia's behavior according to some framework of how countries behave as a template, as a pattern, tends not to work because, of course, they don't subscribe to that same idea that drives so much of the theory in Western countries. This is not to say that Russia is completely exceptional and no rules apply to it, because there are some very fundamental, basic, atavistic, visceral behaviors that actually drive Russian actions. But to try to pretend that they will be rational in the way that other countries would be, and when I say other countries, I mean specifically Western liberal democracies, countries that follow the rules-based international order, is to completely misunderstand what Russia is and to completely ignore not only what it does, but also what it says about its behavior. Because one of the things that we've benefited from greatly during this most recent crisis is President Putin and those around him have been entirely more honest about what it is that they want from the world and how they want to go about getting it. That has, for example, completely torpedoed all of the arguments that we heard over decades that Russia is just responding to NATO enlarging, to NATO accepting membership applications from those countries that wanted protection from Russia. That pretense has been completely discarded by Moscow, and it is this open aggression, it's this open hankering for a return to empire so that more countries are under Russia's control and the resort to brutality in order to achieve that.
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Despite Putin, and we can go back even before the full-scale war was declared, the huge clampdown on civil society and any kind of dissent and media in 2021 that really accelerated, but also the pseudo-academic paper that he published. In essence, it's not academic anyway. It's like the Bond villain who monologues and tells you exactly what he's going to do. Some people are still not listening, however. They're still reverting, as you say, to these sort of stereotypes or to previous models they have, which perhaps, it's comfortable to follow through. But there are other motivations as well, aren't there? Self-interest, economic self-interest is another one where you can sort of brush up the hideous reality under the carpet because we want to get back to Russian hydrocarbons because they have rare earth metals that we need, etc. And it's all too difficult and complicated, and we just wish it would all go away, which seems to be the sort of diplomatic mindset. I've been to a few sort of talks recently, and you'll have some retired diplomats there who pipe up and ask the most, frankly, ridiculous and to my mind, actually reprehensible questions. But it gives you perhaps an insight into that. And there are other reasons too, which I'll come to in a minute. But what's your take on this sort of Bond villain characterization? He's been telling us for a while what is important to him, and it's not NATO.
Well, that's right, yes. And you referred there to the second half of 2021. That's when we saw that Russia had changed gear. Russia was suddenly abandoning all of the things that it previously thought were important, like its relationships with the West, and pushing for what it wanted, regardless of the damage. And as part of that, yes, we had Putin laying out his vision for where he wanted things to go. And yes, people laughed at it, saying it was nothing like what a Western historian would have written, ignoring the fact that he was putting out a manifesto and was preparing to actually follow through on that. But yes, there are vested interests, and it can be something as simple as we mentioned before, if an academic has built his entire career and credibility around presenting facts in the world in a certain way, then it is extremely hard for them to go back on that and actually admit they were wrong, because it destroys careers. It undermines the whole point of their existence. It completely removes the whole purpose of there being an international relations discipline in academia if it turns out actually it doesn't do any good at all. The countries too, as you said, the countries that think they are protected by distance from the Russian threat and count the cost without understanding the risks of not investing those costs. The countries that would prefer Ukraine to sign a ceasefire agreement with Russia as rapidly as possible without realizing that, or possibly realizing but not caring, that if Russia is rewarded with an end to the conflict as it stands at the moment, by being in control of some of those Ukrainian territories that it aspires to, then that just once again rewards Russia for armed aggression and just confirms for Moscow that that is the best way to behave to get what it wants. And let's not forget, if you are sitting in the Kremlin, you don't count the costs in terms of the numbers of young Russians who have died and the amount of material that your ground forces have expended in throwing yourself against the Ukrainian defenses. It is only the benefits that will be counted in terms of whether this was a success or not.
And of course, Russia isn't thinking in terms of election cycles. It's not thinking in these terms of short-term sort of benefit and needing to justify to its people. And this sort of seems to tie in very well with I think it's the thesis of Alexander Etkind, is the idea of internal colonization. And I think people fail to understand how the imperial process works and has sort of worked since Muscovy really came to the fore several hundred years ago. Once it conquers a territory and it's able to subjugate that population, once it's able to subject a portion of that population to brainwashing, then it will use that population to attack the next chunk of land. So by awarding it Donbass, what you get is the weaponization of that population, as we've seen. They've forcing them into the meat grinder to fight essentially against, their own fellow Ukrainians. They don't care about them in terms of the value of those individual lives. And some even will go willingly because of this brainwashing process. And the idea of a sort of stalemate or a pause in the fighting, I'm pretty sure that Putin or whoever post-Putin comes in will be thinking about kickstarting that process again, once they've rearmed, once they've turned that population into the sort of zombies they need. And it's not a process of, year on year. It's a decades and centuries long kind of grinding process of imperial expansion.
That's exactly right. And that process that you've described in the east of Ukraine is exactly the same as we saw, for example, in one of Moscow's previous campaigns of expansion, when it was rolling forward across Eastern Europe, conscripting the populations of the territories that it took over and sending them forward to fight for Russia. But that other point about the longer time span is absolutely crucial, not just because Putin will be planning further ahead, not just because, as most people who have looked at Russia for any length of time understand, if there is a pause in the conflict, it will not be a resolution to it. It'll just be a temporary breathing space for Russia to gather strength again for the next effort against whichever seems to be the most tempting target at the time. But also even on a longer time scale than that. Too many people in the West got used to the idea of the Russia as they saw it during the 1990s and early 2000s, weak, incapable, but also they thought friendlily disposed towards the West and interested in international relations. They took that as the norm, as the new normal, as something which would persist from now on. But if you're looking at it from Moscow, that was the abnormal. That was the temporary interruption to the normal state of affairs. And now Russia is moving back at an accelerating pace towards its historical comfort zone. And that means repression at home, and it means hostility abroad.
And lazily, whether it be politicians or the media, are still pinning this on Putin. But if we take this process of weaponizing a country's population against its neighbors, Chechnya is a classic example. It was implacably opposed to being taken over by Moscow. In fact, many of its cities were absolutely razed to the ground and their populations decimated and tortured, and then a warlord placed to rule over them and terrorize them. And now we see brigades of Chechen fighters being used as part of those shock troops. So there is a classic example of that imperial process at work.
Well, coming back to that first point first, is it a Putin problem or is it a Russia problem? That conversation mercifully has moved on. It's one of the things where the long-term Russia watchers no longer need to work nearly as hard to get over misconceptions about the nature of the Russian system. I think it's far more widely accepted that Putin is not inventing all of the ideas he comes up with. Instead, he's enacting them, and they are very deeply rooted within Russian society. And it's also become much clearer to more people that there is no alternative to Putin, primarily because he's made very sure that there's no alternative. So if you're looking for a liberal democratic opposition to come and replace Putin, as so many people seemed to be hoping for so long, there simply is nowhere to find one. Which means that not only if Putin disappears tomorrow, one from his coterie will take over, and they are all like-minded, but also the extent and the depth of the support that Putin gets for what he is doing from the Russian populace as a whole doesn't mean that there's any impetus for change there, and there will not be unless and until the defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine actually sows that first seed of change.
And that's another point of naivety, isn't it? I was at an event at the LSE just yesterday where Alessia Hramichuk was speaking, and there were several others. Paul Mason, who is absolutely sort of commendable on the topic of Ukraine and very clear-sighted. And yet the quality of questions from some in the audience betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of how this process works. And the fact that Putin is an inheritor of it, and he will pass the mantle on to somebody else. And that, this dictatorship is not imposed on the Russian people against their will. It's largely with the acquiescence, and in many cases with the sort of tacit support of the direction of travel. What the Russians dislike is losing. What they disliked about Gorbachev was the fact that he lost the empire, not that he brought peace. What they dislike, or may turn out to dislike, about Putin is not the war in Crimea, not the war last year, but the fact that he is losing that war in an embarrassing fashion.
That's quite right. And if you look at the responses of ordinary Russians to what is happening in Ukraine, there was a belief for a while that if people within Russia could be brought to understand what was being done in their name in Ukraine, that they would turn against it. But instead, no, they approve of it and they urge the Russian forces on to commit more and better genocide. But you have these waves of immigration as well. You have people leaving Russia because of the war in two waves primarily. First of all, after February 2022, the people who did recognize what Russia had become and wanted nothing to do with it, and so emigrated because they didn't want to be associated with a war that was being waged against their neighbor. And then in September 2022, you had the people who perhaps were ambivalent about the war, possibly even in favor of it, but didn't want to be involved in it personally. And so when Putin declared a partial mobilization of the Russian population, people fled that. And it's interesting looking at the attitudes within those diasporas, within those waves of emigration, because there's an assumption, again, a lazy one, that if people have left Russia, this means that they are not in favor of Putin's policies. But that turns out to be far from the truth. People who may be opposed to the conduct of the war may in fact approve of Putin in general, and vice versa. It is a great deal more complex than simply assuming that because somebody is outside Russia First, they will not be still mentally within Russia or existing on a diet of Russian information. And second, that they might actually be opposed to the current state of affairs of Russia and what is being done by the country. So it is a dangerous assumption to assume that all of these populations that have left Russia are actually positively disposed towards their adoptive countries. What it also means, of course, is that those that are left behind within Russia itself, on average, are likely to be even more in favor and even more supportive of this war of colonial reconquest.
Especially given the demographics as well, that it's largely those who were, under 40, and on the average age is probably even lower than that, who've actually fled, leaving what tends to be the far more sort of conservative older generations, and many of those who have dare I say, rose-tinted spectacles view of the Soviet Union and the Soviet past.
Again, it's slightly more complex than that. Now, yes, it's true that a lot of the people fleeing mobilization will be self-selecting. They'll be the people who are likely to be subject to mobilization, which is males under 40. So it's a specific sector of the population that disappears. But it's a mistake to think that it is only the older generation that has a rosy view of the Soviet Union. We also have the problem within Russia that time has passed and new generations have come along without a clear picture of what the Soviet Union really was. There is a generation that will remember just how grim and unpleasant life in the USSR was, and then a couple more coming after it that only have the propaganda and the old Soviet movies to go by. And if they do not have anything to measure that against, there's nothing to stop them believing what they are told by the current leadership, that the Soviet Union was a golden age. So it's much more fragmented and layered in terms of opinions about what Russia is doing and what Russia was previously than simply a generational divide, or even than a divide between people that get their information from state television and people that get their information from the internet. But the overall strong belief across society does seem to be that, yes, it is normal and natural for Russia to be a great power, and a great power in a very 19th century sense, of which an essential attribute is having other countries which are subjugated to itself.
And there's something in your book, I think you mentioned there, which is that to understand Russia, you need to suspend disbelief. And that is also echoed by the title of Peter Pomerantsev's book, Everything is Possible and Nothing is True. This idea that, there's almost limitless possibilities, but actually, if you don't have some kind of fundamental anchor or concept that there even can exist such a thing as objective truth, then you see what you've just described there, which is, a generational whitewashing of what went before. And people might subliminally or even consciously know how terrible it was, but they choose that alternative reality or alternative interpretation of it.
That's absolutely right. And there's a colleague of ours called Jade McGlynn, who's brought out a book called Russia's War just recently, specifically calling it Russia's War because some people tend to call it Putin's War. But she looks at the patterns of support, how they came about, why it is that Russians exist in this alternative reality with tragic consequences, having been so isolated from real information about the outside world that at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when you have Ukrainians calling their friends, their family members in Russia to explain what is happening, they're not believed because it can't possibly be that they are being bombed by Russians. But the suspension of disbelief is also really important outside Russia for understanding it as well. So yes, I have been saying for many years that in order to understand what Russia might be willing to do, you need to put aside any preconceptions about what makes sense. And that's the reason why this last book, Russia's War on Everybody, is actually dedicated to Vladimir Putin, because in this, again, he's made our work so much easier. I mentioned before the amount of work we used to have to put in to establish the basics, the fundamentals of dealing with Russia. And a lot of that was demolishing the ideas that Russia would conform to normal and natural behaviors as we see them in the West. Now that Putin has proven what Russia is ready to do, and on grounds which are completely unrecognizable from Western motivations for state action, again, a lot of those conversations can be short-circuited because some of the basics have been established for us.
And voices like yours, there have been a few sort of voices in the void, as it were, telling us what might happen. I'm thinking in particular of your books, and I'm thinking here of course, Peter Pomerantsev in the informational space, Ed Lucas very early on pointing out what kind of a character Putin was, David Satter. They've all been on the channel, so has Jade McGlynn, so I advise people to watch those videos in conjunction with this. It will really give them a background on what's going on. But for the first time, I watched an extremely prescient interview with Dzhokhar Dudayev weeks before he was assassinated, and that was extraordinary. You know, he's a man who knows that his country is going to be razed to the ground, who understands what Russia will do with that territory once it has control over it. And he predicted back in the 90s, before Putin was even a thing, before he was prime minister, he predicted that Ukraine would be invaded and Ukraine would triumph. So there is some understanding, if people want to listen to it, of what some of these horrific possibilities might be.
That's quite right.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the 1990s, as we mentioned before, it was the period where there was a cozy belief in the West that actually the Russia problem was resolved and we could all now be friends, which didn't actually align at all with what Russia itself was saying about its place in the world and the kind of relationship that it wanted with the West. The ideas of reconstituting the Soviet Union, of bringing all of those countries back under Russia's control, never actually went away. The key difference was that for an extended period, Russia wasn't in a position to do anything about it. But then President Putin arrived and put in place his 20-year program of getting Russia back in a position so that it could do that. And what came together in the second half of 2021 was two key factors. First of all, Russia's strength, what it thought, fortunately mistakenly, was sufficient conventional military strength to push for what it wanted. And second, the confidence that Putin had been given that he could act without there being costs or consequences from the West. He was under the impression, based on all of the previous patterns of Western behavior, that actually, yes, if he did push forward and move for Russia's long-term strategic goals, he'd be able to do this and it would not be damaging for his country.
I think of Russia and actually Putin's tactics because this label is put on him as being the master strategist, well, until the full-scale war. But actually, I think his method is far more like a sort of highly energetic gas that is just expanding to fill a space. And where it finds no resistance, it will just push forward into those spaces. I mean, it's much more a sort of, throwing spaghetti at the wall kind of approach, the same as the informational warfare, which is obviously a key strategy there. We see that in Trump's speeches as well. They might look like a word salad to us, but what he's doing is testing ideas, testing possibilities to get into people's heads, dozens and dozens of different ideas, all mashed up in a single speech. And to an extent, Russia's warfare is probing continuously areas of weakness. Do you think we understand that now as well, or still is it partial?
Well, I wonder if you're ascribing more of a cunning plan to Trump than actually exists. I have a feeling perhaps his speeches are a word salad simply because that's the way his mind works, as opposed to there's a stratagem behind it. But you've hit on one of the metaphors for Russian influence that comes back time and again, not only over recent decades, but actually over centuries. It's been called a gas. It's been called a liquid, something that seeps forward following the path of least resistance. If you're a soft target for Russia, then you will be exploited by Russia. What that means is that Russia's campaign for global influence over the last few years has been most successful where there has been a vacuum to move into. And that can be a vacuum of Western interest. It can be a vacuum of engagement by the former colonial power, if we're talking about countries in Africa. It can be a vacuum of rule of law. If you look at the patterns of Russian engagement in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they are most successful where there are fewest remaining safeguards against corruption and subversion of government. By contrast, where rule of law remains relatively strong, Russia doesn't make inroads. But the consistent pattern is the same. Lack of resistance invites Russian intervention.
And if we look at those sort of soft underbellies, as it were, obvious ones come to mind. There's the information space in Italy, there's Hungary, Serbia, etc. We know where the weak points are. But perhaps let's look at some of the less obvious ones, because France and Germany, very reluctant at the start of the war to put up serious resistance, lots of emphasis on words and dialogue and ideas and engagement. We'll come to Putin's sort of mafia style FSB mentality. But what one Ukrainian explained to me is that if you come to Putin with words, what he is thinking about you is unprintable. Absolute derision, because there are no words we can use, no words we can use whatsoever to influence the situation. But if you come to that meeting, armed to the teeth and show you're ready to stand up, then you might be able to have some kind of not dialogue but negotiation, but based on more of a sort of mafia sort of power type relationship. France and Germany then seem to have got this fundamentally wrong at the early part of the conflict, and I think in our sort of Anglo-Saxon arrogance we ascribe that to just fundamental weakness and whatever they are, war guilt, etc. It seems to me there might be something far more pernicious underlying that, and that is a real fear, coming back to the academic argument we made earlier about people being comfortable with the devil they know or comfortable with the ideas they know. What we're facing here, that if Ukraine wins decisively, the axis of political and military power will dramatically shift eastwards towards Ukraine and Poland, and it will ebb away from France and Germany. And is some of the reluctance of them to fully engage with a Ukrainian victory also geopolitical, perhaps, in nature?
Well, there's quite a lot to unpack and work through there. We're facing challenges at different levels. There are specific national pathologies which tend to predetermine attitudes towards Russia and whether you can or cannot work with Moscow. But there's also an overarching problem of the general tone and the general attitude of Western diplomacy being completely unsuited to dealing with Russia overall. Now, on those country levels, every country around Europe has its own particular problem in dealing with Moscow. They are self-inflicted problems. They're national pathologies. They're reasons why there are specific interests or specific attitudes within those countries or embodied by their leader that mean that they're not going to make headway with Putin. That's France under Macron with his messianic vision for France striking out on its own way and trying to broker peace deals wherever possible to make France relevant. It's Germany under Scholz with his absolute reluctance to actually do anything. It's the UK under a succession of prime ministers absolutely did not want to look at the problem of Russian influence here because it was deeply inconvenient for not only their political careers, but also their party funding, etc., etc. But then overarching all of that, you've got the idea that you touched on, that it's possible to reason with Putin, that it's possible to cajole or persuade him out of doing something because it doesn't make sense from our side. And that's what led to this procession of senior leaders from Western countries to Moscow in the days, weeks, months leading up to the full-scale invasion in February 2022, basically saying to Moscow, look, we think this is a terribly bad idea, so come on, Putin, old chap, please don't do that. Unfortunately, it had the opposite effect to what was intended, not just for the reason that you said, because it was words, and words won't do any damage to Moscow and therefore will not be taken seriously, but also because in the latter stages of that, when it was becoming completely clear to Western powers, particularly the US and the UK, that Putin was going to launch the invasion regardless, these leaders, these senior figures, these diplomats, these espionage chiefs were going to Moscow armed with that knowledge, confronting Russia with it, saying, we know that you are going to invade, but then not promising any consequences for doing it. So Russia heard the same old words that they'd heard so many times before, that there would be a serious response, and knew from past experience this was something they needn't take seriously. At the same time, they heard people like Biden saying that there would not be a military response to support Ukraine. So what this did was convince Russia that it was actually all right to go ahead. It was a green light for President Putin, because the West was saying, on the one hand, we know exactly what you're going to do. On the other hand, we're not going to do anything that you take seriously to stop it. So go right ahead. And that is a fundamental problem, and the one that you described very, very eloquently there, of dealing with Moscow, coming armed with completely the wrong set of tools and weapons when you enter into those negotiations with Putin.
Exactly. I mean, wanted to put this question to the Russian opposition at some point, but it's like turning up to a knife fight with a spoon, I think, in diplomatic terms. But let's turn to Russia itself, because we've talked about Russia weaponizing many of our sort of weaknesses and characteristics. German war guilt, of course, is another one. I mean, it's not just geopolitical. Germany has an aversion, and the idea of Leopard tanks attacking Russian troops was very difficult for them to get over, and I can appreciate why that is. But Russia also weaponizes its own culture. Whatever soft power it managed to achieve in the 90s, whatever free pass it managed to get for Russian history after the Soviet Union collapsed, and they're able to say, well, that wasn't us, that was, we were victims too. They managed to almost create a sort of a renaissance in how Russia was appreciated and understood in the 90s. Far from being victimized by the West, I think we opened our doors to them and to their cultural products and soft influence. Putin is now burning that up. For him, everything is material he can throw on the fire, whether it be people, whether it be the economy, infrastructure, but he's also burning up culture and Russia's moral and cultural reputation for generations to come. And yet most Russians seem fairly, I mean, they can't do much about it, but they seem fairly relaxed in some instances about that process.
Well, yes, there's a willful disregard of history on one side to go along with the weaponization of it on the other. Thinking of German war guilt, which, as you say, seems to be a substantial motivation for some of the restraint that Germany has shown, it's entirely misplaced. Germany is compensating for having invaded Ukraine in the 1940s by not protecting Ukraine against invasion in the current decade. They're pretending that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact never existed, and that when Germany invaded the USSR, it was actually on the borders of the USSR, as opposed to on that dividing line that these two totalitarian regimes had agreed between them when they decided to carve up Europe. They are completely ignoring the fact that those countries that bore the greatest brunt of the suffering imposed by Nazi Germany during the Second World War were precisely Ukraine and Belarus, those that are suffering again. So it's a twisting of history to suit an entirely misguided agenda that seems to exist in Berlin, which is a parallel, of course, to the twisting of history that's happened in Russia as well. And there, too, you hit on one of the myths that is being exploited, the way in which the experience of the 1990s has been twisted through 180 degrees, so that rather than the West helping Russia, which it did, pouring in billions in terms of direct financial aid, delivering food aid when Russia as a country was incapable of distributing food to feed its own population, trying to draw Russia into the international community by a dense network of links at all levels, from state down to local. And after all, giving Russia, by default, the seat at the UN Security Council that was entirely unentitled to, with devastating consequences now. All of these were methods to help Russia, and yet all of them now are being presented as ways in which the West, quote, humiliated, unquote, Russia during the 1990s at the end of the Cold War. It's a complete reversal of history, and yes, as you say, it is one of the myths off which Putin trades. But you also talked about whether Putin is actually burning Russia's assets in terms of the cultural, the moral, the equities that Russia has in terms of respect for the population and for the civilization and for the society. He's not there yet, because this myth of the good Russian, the idea that Russians are actually frustrated liberal Democrats who are just waiting for Putin to disappear and then they'll turn into Sweden, it will not die. Regardless of how much support we see from among the Russian population for carrying out these atrocities and these acts of aggression, still you have the myth elsewhere that, in fact, there is a viable opposition somewhere within Russia. We just need to find it, and then everything will be all right. So there is a long way to go before the recognition of the nature of Russian society will actually make a dent in those equities, and then that long-standing belief that actually Russia is a civilized nation.
And this is one of the problems, isn't it? And it's a problem that occurs with many people who have studied Russia and lived in Russia, have friends in Russia, maybe had liberal conversations over many years. For a start, that's a very small sample size and it's very distorted. People will say, they'll say, well, but no country is like this. No country has the majority of people who oppose their government. And we see this in the US, we see this in the UK, we see this all over, that weaponized lies will be bought into by big chunks of the population at any given time. And I won't put labels on that because the comments will go sort of crazy. But I think it's a question of proportion, isn't it? Even in Ukraine, you didn't get everyone rising up in Maidan, but you had a threshold number of people, whether it's 10%, 15%, 20, 25, you have enough people who want change that would enable change to happen. And I think what we're not saying is that it's impossible or genetically impossible for a Russian to be a liberal, to live, a liberal life, and to question, their own perceptions of the world. Many people you and I know will say, "Oh, but I know some individuals who are like this," and they'll then try to extrapolate from that. But these are a very, very small number of people compared to the processes and the percentage of the population that were activated in 2013 that helped to bring about Maidan, and of course, probably, maybe even more importantly, the Orange Revolution before that.
Yes, it's a big reason why Russia has been so misrepresented for so long. Now, you hit on an interesting category of people there when you mentioned people who know Russia. Unfortunately, a large proportion of people who present as knowing Russia have only been to Moscow or St. Petersburg and have only interacted with people whose conversation made sense to them, because it's a self-selecting set again. You understand the people who are comprehensible to you, and you tend not to be able to break out beyond that and recognize that Moscow and St. Petersburg, and especially liberal elites or even illiberal elites, the cosmopolitan people, the people who understand the outside world, can present to foreigners, are not representative of the society as a whole. There is a very different Russia beyond the conversations that you have with the democratically inclined urbanites. And it is only now that we start to scratch the surface of Russia and realize just how different that is, especially now that the democratically inclined urbanites tend to have been either jailed, exiled, or dead.
And it never enters, well, maybe it's entering people's heads now, but it didn't previously, that maybe these people you're speaking to aren't telling you everything they believe. And we do this as well. You're in a particular audience with particular people, you'll try to frame your conversation towards things that they'll appreciate, or at least sensitive people do that. And you don't know all of their beliefs. In fact, they themselves may not understand how they'll behave in different circumstances, and how they behave and how their views are expressed in the 90s may be very different to the late 2000s, when they have a home, a mortgage, a family, and they know that their reputation and income are entirely dependent on acquiescence to the state.
I'm sure that's a factor, but it's hard to tell how significant that is compared to the other driver for this, which is the overrepresentation in accounts of Russia and descriptions of Russia and assessments of Russia of people who say things that make sense outside the country, of people who speak in a recognizable language about the way they want Russia to develop, the way they think Russia can develop, and what their role might be in doing so. There's a reason why this fiction of a Russian liberal opposition has persisted for so long, and it's twofold, really. It's the fact that people who hope for a better future for Russia want to cling on to this hope, regardless of all of the times over decades that it's been disappointed, but also because it seems a normal and natural thing, and therefore you emphasize the evidence towards it and tend to disregard all of the vastly greater counter-evidence that Russia is actually disappearing rapidly down the track in the opposite direction from liberalization.
And this is a Ukrainian phrase I heard for the first time yesterday, and that is that Russian liberalism ends at the Ukrainian border. And you can be a liberal, and yet I think we don't appreciate that most Russians might have a sort of deep-seated hankering after the so-called big Russia. So you can be liberal in almost every aspect of your life, and yet you can still be an imperialist, whether you realize it or not.
Yes, it's not just a Ukrainian phrase. It's a commonplace among people who watch Russia and who interact with sections of Russian society, that it doesn't matter how much you might believe, possibly misguidedly, that there is a potential democratic future for Russia. That democratic future also includes Russia being an empire and other countries being trampled underfoot. Those two ideas are not irreconcilable to a Russian, quote, liberal, unquote, even if they would be nonsensical to any of our definitions of liberal. And it's just one of the ways in which what looks like familiar language to describe Russian political views actually hides things which are much more complex and sometimes very alien, even though they use the same terminology as we do.
Let's now turn, because we've got about sort of 10 minutes left. Let's turn to the real problem, I think, which is the broad mass of Russians who acquiesce to what's going on. And it's not that they are, this idea of being sort of passive to evil somehow lets you off. I think that's a very difficult area of conversation. But I don't believe in the concept of passivity, because people have values, people contribute to the economy, they pay their taxes, and that all helps to keep that war machine going. One of the things Putin has been expert at and actually leveraging is the idea of victimhood, and using victimhood as a cover for aggression. And a key part of that narrative, of course, dates back to the Second World War and Russia as a victim, rather than, as you mentioned, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, initiator, actually, of the Second World War. But Russians do have a deep-seated sense of being encircled and threatened. And that is entirely abused and utilized by the regime to control their behavior. So could you describe how Putin has fetishized the Second World War, how he's turned it into this extraordinary lever to control the Russian people, and how that is now turning from being something that not glorifies, but focuses on a violent period of its history, and actually now that violence is becoming a key part of everyday culture and even the education system?
Well, we could go on about this at enormous length because it is such a central part of Russian national mythology now. So I'll have to be brief, but I'm delighted to hear that you have had Jade McGlynn on the show before now, because no doubt she expanded on this at length. Another of her books, The Memory Makers, goes into this in great detail. There are two key aspects to this. And the first, which I think is crucial, and you touched on there, is the way in which the approved history is very different from what actually happened, because Russia has returned to and reinforced all of the Soviet myths about the Second World War, according to which it started in 1941 with an unprovoked assault by Nazi Germany, etc. And Russia was doing absolutely nothing before then. But also, Russia's behaviors during and after the war have been twisted again beyond all recognition. The idea that this was a crusade of liberation of Eastern Europe, as opposed to Russia following through on its initial plan of taking control of Eastern Europe just in competition with Nazi Germany instead of in collaboration with it. The way in which the war it started, as you refer to, is completely elided from Russian history at the moment, and it is a criminal offense to refer to it. People do get prosecuted for pointing out the real events of 1939 and 1940. So with this new and completely unrecognizable, revived Soviet version of war history, that's now the foundational myth, if you like, of Putin's power as well. It's not just the status of the mythology that we saw in the late Soviet Union. It's also giving context to the current war against Ukraine, because the conflation of these two conflicts means that you have the Ukrainians who believe in their country, who believe that the country has a right to exist, being equated with Nazis. The idea being that the normal and natural state of affairs is for Ukrainians to be dominated and governed by Russia. Instead, they fell into the hands of a neo-Nazi clique that is taking them to the West. Therefore, anybody that agrees with this neo-Nazi clique and resists Russia must, by definition, be a Nazi themselves. And this is what lies behind that language we heard very early in the conflict of denazification. So, as you alluded to, the mythology of the Second World War is giving excuses now for what Russia wants to achieve. It gives it a moral justification. It gives it a semi-religious gloss to actually justify so many of the things that are happening. And it makes it easier and more palatable for Russia to understand and to simplify these processes that are happening in the world. Because if you present Kiev as a new Nazi Germany, it makes it extremely easy to categorize the conflict as one of good versus evil, where Russians think they're on the other side to where they really are.
And that makes it very difficult, doesn't it? Because, to eradicate those ideas of weaponized victimhood in Nazi Germany, because again, aggression was very much built on a sense of the injustice of what happened in Weimar post the First World War. It took complete occupation. It took German cities to be razed to the ground. I remember being in Dresden and seeing this statistic that 80% of residential buildings were uninhabited. And that's the proportion of population that was either killed or driven out of Dresden. And that happened over and over throughout Germany. And then it took a generational change of an education process to eradicate these toxic ideas from people's heads. And they never entirely go away. There's no chance, is there, of being able to engineer such a change in Russia. And it's almost like a sort of a feedback loop. Someone who, and this is extremely optimistic and unlikely, but let's say someone who was liberal, let's say Ilya Yashin is the next president of Russia. He is going to face an enormous amount of resistance, not just from the Siloviki, from the GIU, from the FSB, from the elites and oligarchs. He's going to face huge amounts of resistance from the broad population to any kind of process of winding back the brainwashing and, of course, the prejudicial views of Ukrainians as cunning thieves, Nazis, etc., that have been inculcated in literally the last 2 decades of soap operas, dramas, and popular culture.
Yes to all of this. We hear far too much optimism, especially since the beginning of this year, about what will happen once the active phase of fighting in Ukraine is over. And there are far too many perfectly sensible, rational, intelligent people thinking that there will then be a better relationship with Russia because the war is finished. And unfortunately, a lot of the ideas that they have about starting a new relationship are based on the mental image of Germany or indeed Japan after the Second World War, without going through that vital stage that you talked about of a decades-long process of uprooting the constitution, the education system, changing social attitudes, and so on. So whatever happens in Russia, it has to happen organically, which means it is going to take vastly longer. But the key ingredient for it, of course, is going to be defeat in Ukraine, because without a defeat, without a setback to Russian imperial aims that is sufficiently resounding, that it's completely undeniable within Russian society, and Russian society looks for somebody to blame, there will not be that initial seed that might eventually lead to change. And therefore, unfortunately, we are going to be facing precisely the same Russia problem into the foreseeable future. And that is the key reason why so many of these calls for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, for freezing the conflict instead of resolving it, are unfortunately fraught with disaster.
And the last question then, because we're almost out of time, and if I wind back to the prediction of Joker Dudayev, I mean, this is probably the worst way to end because, historians never like to play the what if game. But Dudayev not only said that Russia will pounce upon Ukraine in exactly the way it has, he also said that Ukraine will be victorious. So are you optimistic for that victory? And are you optimistic for Ukraine's future role in NATO, Europe, and as a buffer between, let's say, sort of, golden horde autocracy and our flawed democracy in the West?
Well, two very different questions. I am hopeful. I am not optimistic. I fear that the self-imposed restraint of countries like Germany and the US in terms of not giving Russia the weapon systems and the equipment and the support that they need to win the war, only enough to survive, has gone on for too long, so that they will not actually be in a position to make the gains and to liberate the occupied territories that they need to the extent in 2023 to actually resolve the war. Therefore, it is likely to drag on further. Therefore, the calls for a ceasefire and negotiated settlement will grow stronger. And this next winter, Ukraine might find it even harder to resist. So my fear is that the opportunity to deal that defeat to Russia may have been missed through Western countries subscribing to this idea that you cannot defeat Russia. It's too dangerous. On the other hand, will Ukraine continue to be the front line? Will it continue to be the defenders of Europe? Absolutely, yes, but potentially not the only one. If Russia finds that there is a softer target elsewhere along its western periphery, it will go for the softer target as it always has done.
And wishful thinking perhaps, but if Putin falls, Belarus might fall, and in future years, Belarus could be the new battleground for the frontier of Europe.
The wishful thinking, of course, is not for Belarus to fall, but for Lukashenko to fall, and for Belarus to be able to take the path that a significant proportion of its citizens want towards the West and towards a more democratic future, and one which is not under Russia's thumb without there being a Russia intervention. Now, that is a unique and probably improbable set of circumstances, but it is one which we should be hoping for and working towards.
Well, I want to thank you for the time today. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think the sort of dose of reality is something that every sort of diplomat and politician needs to hear to really understand the situation and deal with it appropriately. I also highly recommend people check out your books. I know this video will do incredibly well on the channel because you've echoed many of the views of people across the political spectrum that I see, in the US, UK, Australia, etc., who watch this channel avidly. And yeah, I want to say thank you, Keir, and for the amazing work you do.
Thank you.